Hello, welcome to your Pre-Primary Sources. I'm Lucy Nolasco, and I'm joined today by Denisha Jones from Defending the Early Years. And we are
Hi.
talking today about a new vision for high-quality preschool curriculum, which is a 2024 publication put out by the National Academies Press, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And did I already say it was from 2024? No, I can't remember what came out of my mouth, but
Yes.
recent-ish.
Yeah.
um, And so I just kind of want to kick off. So pre-recording, we were talking about how, it doesn't feel new, right? It feels like more of the same thing we've been saying about 4-year-olds and about education in general, right? So Janisha, I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you, because we kind of talked a little bit about the essentialist movement. So if you are willing to give kind of an overview of what that is and why that might have informed the attitudes of the authors.
Yeah. So when I was studying curriculum theory, history and theory in grad school at Indiana University, we would spend a lot of time learning about different movements within curriculum history. And so essentialism comes up as one of them. The first one is like the perennialist, right? And so this is the idea that like there are common sets of knowledge that everybody needs to learn regardless of where they're going to end up in life. And it was really about the classic, right? It's like why classical education is beneficial for everyone, which wasn't so bad if classical content wasn't so bad. Like, and then we kind of, but that was how it was early, I would say, like when schools were being founded in like the late 1800s, mid 1800s, right? And then as the Industrial Revolution came about us, right? And we saw a lot of systems about efficiency, about that kind of model from uh, the factory, right? The factory model of like putting parts together for the whole and kind of like streamline everything. That kind of impacted education, and we got to the efficiency movement around curriculum. And so it was really about standardization. It was really about trying to like apply one set of processes to the whole and get a one outcome the same for everyone. So they wanted to do that to education the way they would do it in a factory. And so it's kind of why our high school classes and curriculums are the way they were. There were a lot of papers written by different committees. I think I remember the committee of 1910. I think there's one of 1908 and 1915. I also felt like this is what white men who graduated from Harvard did because they had nothing else to do. Like there was just all these people, they weren't trained in education, but they had elite graduate degrees and they needed something to do. And so they became this managerial class of school leaders, right? And a lot of the people who came out of that movement seemed to be about that. And again, I don't, that's just my remembering from it. I remember thinking that at the time when I read it, but I haven't actually researched that. So nobody come yelling at me and telling me that's not the case. That was just the feeling I got from the information that I read. But it really structured schooling, and a lot of that is still implemented today. So one of the things I remember reading in one of those committee reports was why, like, it said, laid out that every course would begin with a history of that subject area. And it made me think of like every class I ever took in high school, we always began with a history of that subject area, right? That is a holdout from that era, right? And so the idea of breaking things up into subjects and then having certain subjects for one year and then the next subjects next year and kind of like just moving down the factory of high school education all comes from that area of the efficiency. And then this idea about research, right? About really not just research, but like trying to prove that if you do this, this will happen over and over again in education. And I felt like that reading this report, right? Like they're looking about effective curriculum and they're looking at research. And even though they point out limitations, it's still very much like if you do X, Y, and Z, kids will get these outcomes, and that's what we want to see. And so it just felt very like just linked to other stuff that nothing really, I don't know where the new is in this report. I haven't, nothing jumped out at me as being new. I will say they did give a lot of service, lip service, word service to equity and issues around marginalized groups, which maybe that's the new part because they're not really included in so much of the upfront material and throughout, right, the chapters that they're really coming back to that. So maybe that's part of it. But even that, I think, was not done on a deeper process or deeper level that I would have liked to see to go beyond just saying that these people are here and they need attention to, but to actually link why they're not getting what they're supposed to be getting to the curriculums that you're talking about, right? Like none of the
Right.
curriculums that you're talking about were designed to educate African American, Latino, children with disabilities, any of these groups that are marginalized, low income. So then that's like to me the big elephant in the room. Like you can talk about what these kids need, but you don't challenge the fact that none of these curriculums were developed with these kids in mind.
Right, absolutely. And as you were talking about, the white men at Harvard who don't study education but do have a lot to say about it, it made me think of the current conversation culturally around higher education. Right, we've had this
Mm,
reclassification of degrees as professional or non-professional. We've had for probably the last decade or so this very strong movement towards pushing the trades. Right, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with pursuing a trade versus pursuing an academic career degree versus an academic career, right? But as we're thinking about that larger cultural context of what outcomes we want for children today, which
mhm.
do seem again to be largely focused on income, right? We want these quote unquote productive members of society who are self-sustaining, and we just keep pushing that down and going, well, obviously that means that our 4 year olds need to enter 4 and 5 year olds need to enter kindergarten with letter sound connections. And, of course they don't need to read in kindergarten, but they do by first grade. These ideas of just pushing it down further and further and further in the name of kindergarten readiness,
Yeah.
when we know that that's not really how you build life readiness, right? We keep pushing backwards without questioning what they're entering into.
Yeah, I think one of the missing parts for me is that it's not so much that kids, I think, I harp on the fact that kids we are like naturally born wired to learn.
Mm-hmm.
And we're curious and they ask a lot of questions. But I think the natural curiosity that they bring to them is not valued and aligned in most preschool programs or teaching programs. So they lose that love of learning, right? I think it's like we forget that what the goal in the early years is to nurture children who are constantly going to want to learn and ask questions and know more and like have this love affair with knowledge, right? I don't know if it was just nurtured in me, like innate, but I have this love of knowledge, right? Lots of people do, but lots of people don't. And I think sometimes that schooling interfered with that. They might have had it, but then it turned into a chore. It turned into something they didn't want to do. It turned into something they didn't feel good at, right? When you talk to kids about play and learning and like, right, they don't see play as a form of learning anything. Because it's like what they want to do on their own terms and they feel like it's so different and learning is this thing that's done to them that they don't like and they want to take a break from all the time. And like, how do we get there, right? I think a lot of this times because we focus on the wrong things when we're talking about curriculum in preschool and what kids really need, they are the curriculum. They want to do so much, right? If we just kind of focused on them as high quality, right? And that's one thing I don't, and I didn't read maybe chapter 2 gets a lot into the high quality part, but what is high quality? I remember going through this for a summer institute we were doing about D and for DEY. And my understanding with that high quality is really tough to measure because it's really subjective to different people. Some people think high quality is learning academics, like learning early literacy skills, being able to read at 3, right? And things like that. They
Right.
think that's high quality. Some people think just feeling good, like getting up every day and looking forward to going to that place called school, that's a high quality place because my kid wants to go and be there, and that's great. And so it's so subjective. And I remember talking to folks who are still doing advocacy around expanding universal childcare and stuff. And I said, well, what about you doing about quality? And they're like, that's an implementation issue later. We've moved out of because that's where they got hung up. A lot of people who were doing that work
Oh,
got hung up on the quality because they couldn't agree. And you can't get the law passed and get the funding if you're hung up on. So they stopped talking about quality. They're like, let you guys deal with it. Once we get the funding, once we get the law passed and say universal child care is the law of the state, we'll let you guys deal with what quality that means because we can't get hung up on that. And I get it, right? Because it's so subjective to think that there's
right.
one objective 100% high quality that everyone will agree on. And it's the same thing with this curriculum. Is there one objective preschool curriculum that's best for everybody? Absolutely not, right? So then I don't know. I just get caught up in then what's the whole point of all this, right?
Right. It's such a I'm so torn, right? Because I was reading the section about the curriculum, right? I think it was in
Hmm.
chapter 4, talking about the implementation of the curriculum.
Hmm.
And they gave some examples of some of the curricula that they had looked into in creating this. And they paid a little bit of lip service to emergent curriculum, right? It was
Hmm.
there. I think I'm on page 129.
Hmm.
But they then go on to say that, curriculum should come from external forces because educators don't have the content knowledge to be able to create curriculum for young children. And I just got so stuck there
Hmm.
on a few levels because I've been family child care educator, Head Start, private preschools, program director. I've worked in a lot of different, settings and with a lot of different people. And of course, the field as a whole has been struggling with this idea of what is an early childhood professional? What does an early childhood professional know? And
Hmm.
I'm going, I've absolutely been in classrooms with people who would not be able to responsively co-design an emergent curriculum with children.
Hmm.
But I've worked with a lot of people who can.
Yeah, yeah.
And what are we saying about the field as a whole when we say that you can be called an educator without knowing anything about young children or child development
Mm.
or education? And what are we saying, who are these unnamed experts who should be designing curriculum without meeting the children who will be engaging with it?
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if you got the sense too, but I think they've said it several times that this is for curriculum developers, right? They're
Right.
sharing, right? It ends that curriculum developers need to incorporate, like they really want. So who are curriculum developers? They're not early childhood teachers. Are they
Yeah.
currently parenting young children? Because maybe they parented young children 20 years ago, but there's a huge difference, right? And parenting a young child is not the same as teaching a whole bunch of young children who aren't related to you every day for a whole
Right.
school year, right? It's a total different experience. So who are curriculum developers and why is it best believed that they are the only ones who can develop curriculum and that they should be developing curriculum, right? And I say, yeah, I'm not surprised that emerging curriculum is kind of treated as a ugh, right? It's one of those. They also put it in the section on false dichotomies, which I find
Yes.
really interesting because they talk a lot about how low-income children, children of color, children with disabilities, English language learners, all of these children are marginalized. Marginalized children tend to receive one end of that false dichotomy, right? If we go back to that list at the beginning of chapter 4, where they list out all those false dichotomies, academic instruction tends to happen to those kids, right? Highly scripted, teacher directed, content focused, passive acquisition, didactic, right? Um,
Yes.
that's all given to those kids. So you're talking about the needs of those kids, and you're saying we need to get away from these false dichotomies without acknowledging that those kids are typically on the receiving end of one end of that false dichotomy, of that dichotomy. I won't even call it false because it is real. There are some places we've had so many people come to me and tell me that they are being told by their administrators that these children, those kids, don't need play. Those kids don't deserve agency. Those kids don't get autonomy now. So please don't tell me it's a false dichotomy when we have curriculum, not maybe curriculum developers, but people who have bought these curriculums, right? Administrators, directors, principals, buying into this deficit thinking of certain children, those children, and using that against them, right? It's like what I call the misuse of equity, right? Equity, and they
Mhm.
talk a lot about here in equity, but I think people misuse equity when if things instead of saying we give children what they need, right, based on their needs, and that's what equity is about. But then you use that same concept to say those kids don't need that. Those kids need something else that other kids, rich, white, privileged, have, right? Like that's a misuse of equity. That's not what equity is saying that these kids don't need what rich white privileged kids get because that's underlying saying something is wrong with them that they can't have play, they can't have agency, they can't have autonomy, right? And so yeah, I do feel like there's a lot of issues around that. And then yeah, the curriculum developers being the audience, and I think that's what's threatening. An emergent curriculum and play-led curriculum threatens all of this. Like I was thinking, well, what happens if we got rid of that? Then we're putting all these people are out of work that are designing early childhood curriculums, that are creating them, that are getting $1 million, $1,000 contracts with school districts to implement them, right? This is about sustaining their livelihood sometimes. And we threaten that when we say, oh, teachers can actually be taught how to develop emergent curriculum through children's interests. Teachers can taught how to use play as pedagogy, as curriculum. So Yeah, I think there's, and then but it changes the role of the teacher too. And I think that's scary for a lot of people because we don't prepare teachers for emergent curriculum, play-led curriculums a lot. And so if we're going to make that switch, we have to change then what does it mean for our work as teacher educators and teacher preparation as well too. And that's all threatening, I think, as well too.
Right, absolutely. It goes back to that who has control over the classroom, right? The kids who, can't be trusted to play freely versus, well, what's my role as the educator in supporting them? Because there is an unmet need here.
Yes.
What's that
Yeah.
need? How can I support them in, paying attention, using pro-social skills? There's something that needs to be acquired and can be acquired through this play in collaboration with the adult. It's not that a play focused curriculum excludes the teacher, right? It's a very active, very involved role for the adults in the
Yeah.
room.
Yeah, and it's actually to me, I think it's a higher order level of teaching than what we typically tell teachers of young children, which is that scripted curriculum. I say you
Right.
repeat, I do, you do, right? It's very different. When I was in China and Anji, these teachers they get together and they have these really deep conversations watching the play of the recording videos about the child, and they're theorizing about children's engagements, what they're learning, and then all of that is going into their intentional planning for the next day. And then they lead these hour-long scaffolded conversations with the children about their play. And that requires a lot of skill because you don't want to just tell the kids why your little thing didn't work, right? Which is what we're
Yes.
tempted to do. Oh, just close the gap and the ball will go. No, 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 that's not her job. Her job is to skillfully talk with them to see if they can uncover and to understand from their thinking of what they're saying how they're making meaning of the situation and then what can they introduce in the environment the next day to kind of push that thinking along. That's a whole higher level of teaching. And I think most teachers would be happier doing stuff like that if they were given the opportunity because it's so much more sustaining to who you are as someone who cares about the development of young children. But we think teachers can't do that and we don't trust them to do that. And it's not easily packaged and it's not easily scripted. And so we don't offer them that.
Right. I mean, the article does, or kind of, it says that, implementation is obviously going to be impacted by the teacher, which is mostly true. I was looking at one of the curricula that they noted in the introduction, right? It's the circle
Hmm.
curriculum.
Mm,
It looks like it was picked up in Texas, but it's freely available online, which is why it was cited in the introduction, which is why I was able to access it. And I'm looking
okay.
at the activities there and going, I haven't seen anything that I disagree with other than saying that we should teach 4-year-olds the Pledge of Allegiance and have a moment of silence afterwards as part of their social studies curriculum. I disagree with that. But
Mm,
um, there were other things that were fine. There was a game of Picky the Puppet where you feed the Picky Puppet things that start with the letter sound that they want that day. And there's
hmm.
nothing wrong with it, right? There are children who would enjoy it. It would be fine. They
Yeah,
would
yeah.
make that connection. But it doesn't engage nearly as much of the thought that young children need to do, right? Because if it's interesting to young children, it's a skill that is actually within that zone of proximal development, right? I can see that being a very interesting game to play for 2 to 5 minutes when it's novel, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And then once a child has a grasp of that letter sound, okay, cool, I'm out. Um, but it's just that what Lillian Katz called the academic and intellectual skills, right? I feel like that's always where I
Hmm.
end up.
Hmm.
Do we want children to develop these academic skills for their own sake, to feed the picky puppet things that start with P? Or do we want children to be able to grow into larger people who can record their knowledge, who can take in other people's knowledge from books and stories, and who can use these ideas and concepts and apply them? And how are we really making it clear from a letter sound game the actual real use of letters?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think I mean, it goes back to that idea that, like, I think that a lot of us can't break free from the experiences we had in education and when we were young, right? So we hold on to that. When I do a lot of work with teachers, I have to get them to, like, oh, let's talk about what you remember from early childhood, some of your best activities that you remember doing. And and I go through and I said, okay, now imagine that you're teaching in a place and you can't do none of that. You can't do anything that you did before. You got to start over. You got to start fresh. You got to break free. And it's really challenging. A lot of them tell me they can't think of anything because they don't know, right? And so then where do we talk about where do you get the ideas from and how do you get the ideas from? And they talk about, well, what are the children already doing? What are they interested in? What are they excited in? How can you use that, right? Because if you don't want to keep doing just what you did, because then we just keep doing it and we don't really think about, well, what is it beneficial? That activity like handprints, right? Everybody does the finger hand for what? I mean, turkeys don't even look like that if it's just a turkey thing. And like we talk about the problem of, doing that for that holiday and stuff, but what is it? What do we want children to get out of it, right? And some they start to get it, but it's hard. It's challenging. I think we have to deprogram ourselves from this idea that children should be doing these things because we did these things, right? And instead of saying, what are children interested in? What are they capable of? What do they want to experience? And bring that to them, right? And it's just a different approach and a different way of being that's not really going to fit in this evidence-based curriculum type. And my other thing is thinking about like how these curriculums measure learning. They said in the beginning that it's based on outcomes. So the curriculum has to have outcomes for children, and then they have to measure those outcomes against the children who participated in the curriculum and the children who didn't, like the control group. And then they can create an effect size. Now I'm a researcher, but I have lots of issues with quantitative research, mainly because of my heart just doesn't believe in the numbers. I do more qualitative research because I believe in stories and hearing directly from people and what they're saying, which is very different than the numbers. But I also think it just limits our understanding of what learning is if it's only something measurable. And so it got me thinking because they're in their short section in chapter one of the chapters about play. Oh yeah, and in the beginning of where they list all the false dichotomies and they talk about play, but they say, play is something important for children, but they don't connect it to learning because the research hasn't been able to prove that play is the cause of someone learning an outcome. How can we ever know? We know the outcome is measured. We say a child can do this. This is something a child can do. We can never know for sure if that came through play, through direct instruction, anything. We can study it all we want and we can hope and say, well, right after this assessment, right after this lesson, the kids could do this. And we can say that, but then what about a week later? Do they remember that? Or was it just tied to that library? There's so many factors that we can't control for. And so I think they see, well, play can't be evidence-based because it's not able to prove, we're not able to statistically say this outcome came through play. But if we pull away from the need for a good preschool curriculum to be based on measurable outcomes, right? And we look at what children are actually doing in play and their development and and how they talk about it, maybe we would see it differently, right? But then that blows up that whole standardization factory model because play is not standardized. Play can't be, it's not the same kid doing everything, they're doing different things, how they feel. And so it threatens all of that. And I think that's one of the main issues I have with this too.
Right. And it's hard when you're an educator working in this situation where you need to draw a line between children's play and outcomes. You've got, 25 children to write up observations for, and you can very clearly see these academic standards in their play. You can see the children playing with language, making rhymes, singing songs, and say, oh, this aligns with standard one, two, three, and here's how. But you're not going to get that same quantity of data that you would from a developmental screening or a test when you run it on each of those children to get those immediate outcomes. So even when it's richer knowledge, deeper knowledge, and self advocated, self learned, self taught, self driven, it's not going to look as robust as one of
Yeah.
these factory models.
Yeah. And
Um,
and kids are not going to talk about it the same way, right? Like they can have a
mhm.
conversation with you about their play and use all this sophisticated language and demonstrate all this stuff. But then when a test question is asked, right, it doesn't always compute that that's the same that question is asking for what they just said, but now regurgitate it in this test format, right? So it kind of throws them for a loop sometimes, right? And so well, people say, well, then it's not really learned because I can't measure it. Or are your measurements unable to measure what kids are actually learning in play? That's two totally different things, right? And then we get back to the do we need it measured? I remember being at the Anji conference and said, look, we know that play is valuable for its value. I don't need a study to tell me it's valuable, but other people do. But like, is that something we want to go down the line? Do we want to create measurements for studying the effectiveness of play, or is that just going to feed us into this bubble that we don't want to be in the first place, right? It's like going back and forth on what needs to happen. And so I'm still on the let's rethink the whole measurement in the first place. I do think that teachers can can, in that sense of an emergent curriculum, in that sense of leading with play, that they can document, like you said, these standards are being met. This is what they can document, like how approaches to learning. They can think about, make the thinking visible that the children are doing, and show that this is the thought process. These are the concepts the kids are engaging in, and I think that's important. But the whole idea of measurement takes it to a whole nother level that I think is really problematic too.
Yeah. I I wonder too, I was looking at this and kind of going back a little bit to what they sort of try to call culturally relevant curriculum, right? And culturally
Hmm.
relevant teaching and learning. And they also talk about family engagement.
Hmm.
And it feels like the way they use that in here is giving families homework to do with their children, right? It's less about honoring the parent as teacher and transmitter of cultural knowledge and more about bringing them into the hegemony of the school system.
Mm.
Um, it,
Yeah. I think that goes back to that misuse of equity, right? Like it's like
mhm,
now we're getting all the buzzwords put into something that fundamentally is not changed. And if
mhm.
we are, I mean, if we're really talking about changing early childhood education to meet the needs of marginalized kids, we can't use the same constructs, right? Because those constructs have been used against marginalized children from the beginning. So how can we just say, we got to pay attention to this and put that in here, but then not change any of the real parameters, right? And so, what do I like? What's anything like just the measurements, the way we measure outcomes? I think one part they did mention it, right? That some of these studies tend to be done on low income kids. Head Start. Head Start tends to be a ground for a lot of these
Yes.
studies, right? But in most research outside of Head Start, I remember teaching this article when I was at Sarah Lawrence. It's something they use the acronym WEIRD, and they say most research participants are the WEIRD, the Western Educated Industrial. I forgot what the R stands for, and then D is developed, I think, right? Countries.
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
most research comes from universities that serve predominantly white middle class and upper class families, and most participants come from whether even a child study, right? Who's gonna find out about a child study at university? Other academics who have young kids, and so their kids tend to dominate a lot of the research studies. Like most research across the world is on this very narrow population that can't be extrapolated to everyone else. But then you are using that research findings to denigrate a whole bunch of other children. I remember having my students read about that supposed the word gap, right? And how
I was
people
just going to
talk.
bring that up. Yep.
Yeah. Ivory Tolson is a great Dr. Tolson. He's editor of the Journal of Negro Education. I think it's called, yeah, Journal of Negro Education. He's at Howard University. In his book called Bad Stats, right, where he's arguing that
Mhm.
Black people don't need more bad stats about them. He even says, like, are there even 400 million words? Like, come on, like that. Where did this come from? And so when you get into it, the study came from a very small population of like 160 kids, and I don't think most of them are children of color. But yet we are being told that children of color are at a disadvantage and know 400 million less words than other kids, right? And so to me, if you're going to center a new curriculum model on these kids who are being marginalized, you're not going to try and put that within the same constructs that have always limited them. You have to get outside of that whole thing that you're the whole model that you're looking at, right? And so they don't do that. And I wonder, like, was that intentional, or is that just inability to see beyond what you're actually doing? I don't know.
Right. It is hard to reconcile this because they'd spend more time than most, which is not a great measure, but they do put some words to this focus on equity and inclusion
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
manage to just reproduce a lot of the same. And I listeners, I'm white. I can't speak to the lived experience of other people, but it's hard to see having worked in programs that serve predominantly wealthy white children and programs that Head Start and other programs that serve more diverse groups of children. um, it's hard to see that in action that the what those wealthy white parents want is what they've seen advocates say is good for children, right? They want that free play. And they also have that little safety net in their mind of, and if they need tutoring to catch up later, we've got the money for it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Versus this. sense that's been ingrained in some individuals who have been historically marginalized, where it's like our children are starting behind, which is not the case.
Yeah.
And they're still made to feel that way.
Yeah. And I'm Black, and so I do speak about this because I write about, I didn't know if this is going to be videoed or just audio. It's probably just audio. So
Yeah.
yes, I identify as Black woman, African American, and so I do a lot of research. I've been studying a lot now on children's racial learning and racial identity development. I'm, like I said, I'm glad they talked. They said anti-racism, not just anti-bias. They said children's racial identity and sense of belonging and things like that. But I take the stance that the entire system is needs to be interrogated and challenged and just and a lot of it disrupted and dismantled because it starts from a premise that there is something wrong with Black and brown children and to begin with, like you said. And so that's the starting point. And I have to do this with my students when I was teaching all the time. Again, well-meaning, white, liberal, young women at an elite college in New York City that costs way more. Like I didn't even know it existed because like I couldn't even imagine going there as an undergrad because it's very expensive, right? And they come in with all these great intentions, but also with a lot of these deficit thinking out the box, right? And I say, what if you start from the premise that Black and brown children are brilliant? All children are brilliant. Like, why don't we start with that? Even, I don't care if they're autistic, I don't care if they have severe, there's still brilliance in there. It's our job to unlock that brilliance and to see it for what it is. But what happens if we start at that basis, that all children are brilliant and they come from families that love them? Some families are going to struggle to love them in ways that are good and healthy, but that doesn't mean that love is not there. It's they're not able to access it right the way other families do for different reasons, right? And everyone looks at me like I'm crazy, like I'm Pollyanna and out on them because, and I'm like, but that's what we need. We need to uproot everything that says that there's something wrong with these kids and they need something that other, they need you to stop thinking there's something wrong with them. That's a great quote by Ibram Kendi that I have up sometimes, and it says the only thing wrong with Black people is that we think something's wrong with Black people. And so it's the same thing. The only thing wrong with marginalized children is that we think something is wrong with them, and then we continue to marginalize them in the name of stop, like it's like it just goes back and forth. And I think unless you're willing to come out that zoom out big time and really think about those kids, you're just gonna keep repeating the same patterns.
Right. Yeah. It's just echoes of the overrepresentation of Black children in special education programs, right? Where we think we're being helpful. We're saying, oh, no, we're going to catch you up to grade level when that's not the issue. The issue is that they're predominantly white teachers have said they're not, doing XYZ on grade level. And
And even if we caught them up to supposedly where, like the metrics just move, right? I remember that was
right.
one of the big takeaways I got in Segregation by Experience, the book that they cite in one of the chapters by Jennifer Keith Adair and Kayomi Sanchez Colgrove, Sanchez Colgrove, yeah, or Suzuki Sanchez Colgrove. They talk about how agency and about how most children of color, low-income children of color, are denied their agency. And they're told it's always like, if you do this, you'll get it. But then the line always moves, right? They're never able to, if they all did what they were supposed to do, right? Then we would just change the markers because there is a clear competition among keeping some children as the in the bottom, right? And if we let everybody move up, then where would we be, right? And so I think that happens a lot that children we keep telling me if you do this, this will happen. If you do this, and it doesn't, right? And we don't and we blame the parent. Oh, you didn't do what we said you would do, did it? No, the system is going to keep moving the goalpost as we try and get closer and closer to equity or equality, right? Because it wasn't designed for us.
Right. Yeah. I think so. The last thing that I wanted to touch on, right, was sort of going back to where we started, this idea of where we want children to be and kindergarten readiness,
Mm,
right? Because it starts off with children who are in high quality programs do better than children who are home before entering kindergarten. And I struggle with that
hmm.
because the way we're measuring kindergarten readiness, because the children that we know are in family, friend, and neighbor care prior to kindergarten entry are already from historically marginalized and ongoing marginalized communities. And I worry that it positions education against the family. It's this subtle government overstep, which is also a
Mm,
phrase that I struggle with. Uh,
hmm.
there are a lot of conflicts here. but the idea of positioning education against families in the early years really doesn't sit right with me.
Yeah, and I do. I hear the like the issue you're grappling with, right? Because on the one hand, that's been the argument against universal early care and education, is that it's a government
Right.
overstep. You're forcing your kids. That's why I think we need to talk about care, child care, universal child care, and
Yes.
universal preschool. They're two different things, right? At the end of the
Ooh,
day,
okay.
most parents who are working need care for their young children, right? Even if you're not working, I'm sorry. If you're a full-time stay-at-home mom, you also need to take them kids somewhere sometimes so you can do other
Yes.
things and get a break. Most people want that kind, but they don't want forced curriculum learning onto their children, right? That is I think, for the young children because some children aren't ready for it. I just someone I follow online posted something about, she didn't believe somebody said, why are we forcing young kids to read? We should wait. And they're like, I got taught to read when I was 2. What's the big deal? And I'm like, it worked for you, great. But do you know how many kids hate reading now because reading was introduced too early and they never got it. And now they hate it. Like it's a developmental process, and we have to like slow down on when we introduce it and not make kids feel like I don't want to learn to read now because this is such a chore. So I think it's important to not to give parents the options. Yes, parents need care, but is universal child care and universal preschool are not the same thing, right? And so even if you said it's preschool for 3-year-olds, should that be academic instruction or should that be kids playing all day, right? In a space where they're safe, they're well cared for, they have everything that they need, and they can engage their development further, right? And so I do get that, and I don't agree with that, right? I think attending preschool for what purpose though? If you're only attending preschool to get ready for kindergarten, if you're turning like an academic preschool just to get, then no, I would say your kids are better off at home with you playing and because they're getting more of that deeper development and not the focus on surface skills, right? That happens a lot as well too. And so, yeah, but I don't want to say the government is forcing, but that's what people are afraid of, right? That not that it's an option and say, oh, you can put your kid in early care and education for free, but that it's mandated by the government that they're going to come and say, like they do with public school, right? Most
Mhm.
states have a law that you can't keep your 5-year-old home unless you're going to, and I don't know if you looked through the homeschool application. I had to look through it last year because we were moving the country and I had a couple months where my kids weren't going to be in school and I was trying to figure out what to do. It was a lot. I was like, let me just put them in an online program because it's a lot to just say you're going to homeschool. So that's a, mandated requirement and people don't want to see that for 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds, right? And
Right.
I get that. And that's none of us are advocating that. We're saying every parent should be able to access universal care for their children if they want it, right? For a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, if they want it. And it should be free and it should be, there should be options. Some parents might want their kids in a preschool program at 3. Okay, that's doing academics. I can't tell you not to do that. It's not my job to tell you not to do that. You want to do that, do that. But some parents want play or they want Reggio or they want Montessori. But those programs are typically not available to low income parents, especially play, I will say, right?
Right.
Because they're not evidence-based. So if it's not
Hard
an
to write a grant for, yeah.
evidence-based curriculum, the government's not going to pay for it. Again, they're telling low-income families, your child can't get this for free. Rich people can pay for it for their kids, but your child can't have this on our dime. And so that becomes like another just which yeah. But I don't know if that gets to your point about that. I see it there, the tension. But yeah, that sentence throws me for a loop too, because it's actually opposite what Dale Farron out of the Tennessee study had said and what other people
Yes.
have said. And I think that's why when I read that's the pushback I feel a lot of this is against, right? Tennessee studies showed that academic preschool did not have lasting effects beyond kindergarten, right? Kindergarten, sure, but not beyond, not in 3rd grade, not in 6th grade. And those kids were doing worse. And again, no one can know for sure why because they really didn't measure what was happening in the universal pre-K program they were in. And so there were some, people thought maybe it was low quality, maybe and then people might argue, well, maybe they weren't using a good curriculum. Maybe they were. And it was great for kindergarten, but it wasn't great beyond that, right? Because it didn't go deeper. It didn't go deeper, but
Right. And then we're back at the Head Start fade out effect. And we can keep talking for another 6 hours. But thank you so much for your time and knowledge, Denisha. I really, really, really appreciate you having this conversation with me today.
Thank you for
Um,
having me. It was really great. And I hope it made sense. And I think in the end of the day, it's hard because we don't like, I don't believe there's one answer to all of this, right? And I think that's what people are trying to push here. And it's kind of like, okay, if you, but there's lots of options and there's lots of things that we can all be doing, parents and teachers, and that we are doing. I think we lose sight of the fact that so many early childhood teachers and parents are doing the right things to prepare their kids not for school, but for life. Like they're in life, right? Like they're like making their
yes.
life right now meaningful and happy. And I think that's what we really want to focus on.
Yes. Thank you so much. Pre-primary Sources is part of the Early Childhood Network.